what was going on in America during the medieval period, when knights, feudal lords, and princesses were gallivanting around Western Europe. Hi, my name is Grayson. Welcome to another Based Theory. In honor of an upcoming road trip of mine to the American Southwest to visit the Sky Islands of southern Arizona, I thought it was a good time to bring up this subject, which is something that has personally fascinated me for many years now. So in this video, we're going to be doing a tour of America during the medieval period. So just as a brief recap, we're going to be looking at the High Medieval period, the High Middle Ages. This is going to be mainly focused around the 1100s or the 12th century. So just to give you some idea of what was going on in the rest of the world outside of America during this period of time, this is the same time where you have the traditional view of, the High Middle Ages in Europe. You have the Kievan Rus over in Eastern Europe. You've got the Abbasid Caliphate and the Seljuk Turks in the Middle East. This is a little bit before you see the rise of the Delhi Sultanate in India. You have the Khmer Empire in Southeast Asia, the Song Dynasty in China, and in Africa there's the Kingdom of Ghana, and in the next century the rise of the Mali Empire, which would go on to become basically the wealthiest empire in this entire period. Precursors to the Incas in South America, the Tiwanaku, as well as the Mayan Empire in Mexico. But for this video, I specifically want to focus on the land that will eventually become the United States of America, because many people don't really have a firm idea of just what kind of advanced, really fascinating civilizations existed in America at this time, and that's a real shame. So today, there is so much ground to cover on this topic. I could talk endlessly about all of the amazing Native American tribes that were living in America at this time. So I thought I would limit myself to talking about just three of some of the largest, most politically centralized civilizations that existed in America at this point. So since I'm going to be going to the Southwest, leaving tomorrow, I thought this would be a good place to start our journey of medieval America. But first we have to start with corn. Now, it is difficult to undersell just how big of an impact the introduction of corn had to the societies of America. There were staple crops before this period, like sunflowers and squash, but really there's nothing that can match the kind of caloric density that corn can provide an agricultural society. Corn enabled the kind of populations necessary to establish more large-scale civilizations. And this is evident in the American Southwest with the Chaco Canyon culture of the ancestral Puebloans. Now, there are a few different cultures in the Southwest. There is the Hohokam in what's now Arizona, which had its largest city in Snaketown, which is modern-day Phoenix. In fact, Phoenix was sort of named from using the old irrigation systems of Snaketown and revitalizing them like a phoenix rising from the ashes to suit the European colonizers that established Phoenix. There's also the Mogollon culture that's in sort of northern Mexico and the very southern portion of this area, but by far the largest, most population dense, and most powerful at this period of time in the 12th century was the ancestral Puebloans. Now, most people are familiar with the traditional stereotypical image of the ancestral Puebloan people of having the cliffside adobe architecture, which is quite famous. Now, they would grow large fields of corn up on the mesa tops, and then for protection would live down on the side of the cliffs. This way, anytime that there was any threat from the people around them, then they could always retreat back to their dwellings that are literally located on a cliff. They could pull up the ladders, pull down the ropes, and it'd be pretty defensible position. And the largest, most impressive architectural buildings of these people will occur around the 12th century, just around the time period that we're talking about. But by far, the largest, most important population center of this culture was not built into a cliffside, but was instead the monumental palace structure of Pueblo Bonita in Chaco Canyon. Now, on the face of things, Chaco Canyon might not seem like a very good place to build such a center of population density. It doesn't really have the kind of landscape that can support mass agriculture. So it's going to be reliant on the agricultural areas to send foodstuffs into Chaco Canyon. And what we can see is a network of around 100 other population centers surrounding Chaco Canyon that would all funnel both resources and people to the site. What is evident at the site of Chaco Canyon is massive social hierarchy. There is a very clear haves and have-nots. The vast majority of people there were living outside of the grand house of Pueblo Bonita. They were living in much smaller, much more primitive dwellings in the area around and providing labor to the people that did live in Pueblo Bonita, which had about 500 rooms and supported around 12 families. And these 12 families were living good. They had access to all of the trade good resources in the surrounding regions, as well as all the way down in Mexico. The trade routes connected them. In fact, they were wearing and decorating with very colorful parrot feathers from Central America as far away as Guatemala. So their trade influence extended far and wide, and they were both importing and exporting trade goods throughout much of America. It seems evident from the archaeology that the people that lived in the big house did not do a lot of physical labor like those that lived outside of the big house. They would kick back and drink cacao, which is basically just hot chocolate, and they'd be wearing all kinds of wealthy copper, all sorts of turquoise, which was a huge exporting good to the rest of America from this region. So they were very materially wealthy despite living in an area that doesn't have much immediate resources. So there's lots of evidence for a sort of political hierarchy for all the lands surrounding Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon sits like right in the middle of all of these trade routes. There's evidence that people from all around the surrounding areas would make regular pilgrimages into Chaco Canyon, similar to like Mecca. So the consensus of archaeologists and anthropologists so far is that Chaco Canyon was a kind of pilgrimage site, a holy site, and that the big house was the center of religious activities in much the same way that the Pope would live in the Vatican or the Muslim pilgrims to Mecca. Now, there is a trend among modern archaeologists that sort of dismisses the idea that any pre-Columbian Native Americans would have been able to have polities or political organization at the state level, but it does seem like most of the hallmarks for this are met by Chaco Canyon. However, it is still not really viewed as a polity in its own right. However, I tend to think that in addition to the clear cultural and religious hegemony that Chaco Canyon had over the surrounding areas, there was also likely a degree of political hegemony as well. And this is actually reflected in a lot of the mythologies of the descendants of the Puebloan peoples today, such as the Hopi or the Zuni. Many of these people actually have oral traditions of the time when there used to be kings. They actually don't have an exact word for king in their language, but they would refer to the time where they were slaves to the great king, the great gambler, as he's known, because in the stories he kind of got the fealty of a lot of the native people and tribes in the region by playing these gambling games in which he would win and the people would have to serve him. So they have a lot of mythologies around the time when their people used to be slaves to this king. And they tell of a time when they finally threw off the yoke of these kings. And they even talk about how they would travel east to try to get away from Chaco Canyon area to where they are presently settled, and they would do a ceremony of forgetting in order to forget the trauma that they had just gone through. So there is some evidence for a sort of political domination of the elites of Chaco Canyon over the surrounding peoples. But it is clear that the people in the surrounding area would travel to Chaco Canyon for all sorts of religious rites and ceremonies. This was seen as a very, very holy place. They were adept at astronomical observations, predicting eclipses and the movement of stars and planets. In addition to the 30-foot walls of Pueblo Bonito, which would have been a gargantuan palace structure visible for a large area surrounding Chaco Canyon, there was also the underground kivas, which were forbidden for a lot of common people to enter. And I should be clear that Pueblo Bonito was not the only great house, although it certainly was the biggest and most religiously sacred. There were many of such great houses in the surrounding areas, and most of them also had kivas, which were these underground chambers for doing all manner of religious ceremonies. Sometimes the most holy priests would be disappearing into the kivas for many, many days, if not weeks, performing religious ceremonies. Now, I have actually been to Chaco Canyon, and I've been in a recreation of a kiva at Aztec ruins in the Four Corners area, and it is a sight to behold. I would definitely recommend going to Chaco Canyon. It's really, really awesome walking through the ruins of Pueblo Bonita and seeing just the scale of this civilization, as well as the cliffside dwellings like in Mesa Verde of the ancestral Puebloans. The architecture of these people really is astounding. Now let's get along to some of the more based theories about Chaco Canyon, because it is still considered to be largely a mystery about how the rise of Chaco Canyon occurred, just who were these elites at Chaco Canyon, what kind of power they held over the surrounding people. And now the really, really interesting thing, to me at least, I mentioned that several of the Puebloans' descendants today still have mythologies that could be pertinent to this period. So when they threw off the yoke of these previous kings, the great gambler and the people of the Great White House, as they called them. And yes, the irony of them calling it the White House in America is not lost on me. But what happened to these elites once they were overthrown? Well, the mythologies vary somewhat from tribe to tribe and clan to clan, but some say that, they just lopped their heads off right there. They got rid of the oppressors, the Puebloans, the Pueblos united and overthrew these kings in Chaco Canyon. But there are some other stories that they went and fled to the south. Now, what I find really, really fascinating about this topic is the language that these ancestral Puebloans would have spoken. Now, they are a part of a language family that is shared by the Aztecs. Yes, those Aztecs. Well, it turns out that in the Aztecs' own mythology, there were a people group that were not native to that region in Mexico. In fact, they conceived that they came from a land called Aztlan in the far north. Now, what's north of Tenochtitlan? And who shares the same language family as the Aztecs? Yes, the ancestral Puebloans. Now, I'm not saying that this is definitively the case, but the timeline does add up for the fall of Chaco Canyon to the rise of the Aztecs. And certainly we know that the elites of Chaco Canyon that presided in Pueblo Bonito would have been some sort of noble aristocratic class that is used to power, and they do seem to use a lot of more southern Mesoamerican styles, like drinking cacao, decking themselves out in parrot feathers. They very might well have viewed themselves as a member of this overall cultural sphere of Mexico. I mean, certainly at this time, there were many such other political configurations in Mexico that look very much like what was happening in Chaco Canyon. So, is it very far-fetched to think that when the Puebloans rose up against the elites of Chaco Canyon that they fled to the south and eventually could have their descendants given rise to the Aztec Empire? It's something to think about. But let's move on from the Four Corners area of the American Southwest and move to what is the highest population density civilization in America at this time, with by far the largest land area of cultural influence and by far the largest population. In fact, the capital city of this culture would be the largest city north of Mexico from this period all the way up until the 1800s. So the Boston and Philadelphia of the American Revolution and George Washington's presidency were smaller than the capital city of the Mississippian culture. That is Cahokia. Now, Cahokia is the largest, highest population city in America at this point in time. Cahokia is also the site of the largest pyramid north of Mexico. It's generally referred to as a mound, an earthwork, but it is a pyramid. Regardless of whether or not they built it by piling dirt up in the shape of a pyramid or how they would have done it in South America with stone, it's a pyramid. Cahokia is located in what is modern-day Illinois, but it's very close, just a few miles outside of the city of St. Louis. And I've been there as well, and it is quite a sight to behold. Now, the Mississippi is the largest river in America, and in this time, and indeed in the time periods before this, the people of the Mississippi were all interconnected in a series of highly cohesive trade networks. This goes all the way back to the period when you had the Roman Empire. Well, in America, you had the Hopewell interaction sphere, which is honestly a fascinating topic in its own right, but for today, we'll just leave it as a highly connected trade network all throughout all of the areas touched by the Mississippi and its various tributaries. I mean, it was huge from Ohio to Louisiana. It contacts, again, all the way to Mexico. And just like with Chaco Canyon, in fact, maybe even more so, the Mississippian cultures were incredibly hierarchical. In fact, the elites of the Mississippian cultures literally lived above the common people. They lived on top of these mounds. They built their homes on top of these giant mound earthwork pyramids and literally lorded over the normal people. Normal people were not allowed to set foot on top of these mounds. And it was seen as the elites literally being closer to heaven, to God, to the sky. They were actually the first ones to wake up, to be the first people to greet the sun each morning. When the great chief would wake up in Cahokia, the first thing that he would do at sunrise is he would take a puff of his tobacco pipe in each of the cardinal directions, north, east, south, and west. The cardinal directions were massively important to the Native Americans. Not just the Mississippians, but Chaco Canyon and most of the Native American tribes across America had the sacred 4 directions, or the sacred 6 directions, including up and down. And tobacco was also a very, very sacred herb to the Mississippians. I mentioned that the chief was smoking out of a tobacco pipe, a peace pipe, but in addition to tobacco, another import from the South is again corn. In fact, the 3 agricultural products that were the most important and sacred to the Mississippians and still to this day to several Native American tribes are called the 3 sisters: corn, squash, and beans. Now, I mentioned that their culture was very hierarchical. This extended to the settlements as well. While Cahokia was the main center for the entire region, you had several regional hubs. There was Spiro in Kansas, for example, which would receive tributes and trade goods from all the areas around it and would have its own chief. but they would ultimately funnel a large tribute to Cahokia, and you'd have the chief that reigns over all the other chiefs in Cahokia, who again was residing in the largest pyramid north of Mexico. Higher than all the other chiefs, higher than all the other people. I have been to Cahokia myself, and I have stood on top of that earthwork pyramid where the Grand Chief house would have been in this era. And it's pretty cool, especially standing there at sunrise. I didn't smoke tobacco in all the four cardinal directions, but it was definitely a very special feeling welcoming in the sunrise, standing at that spot. It was quite a privilege. And this chief would have been decked out in all kinds of copper finery. These Mississippian peoples were master coppersmiths. They made things out of copper that are still mind-blowing to perceive today. I've seen many of these artifacts, especially the copper plates, and the art that these people did is really amazing to behold. I'll include some images here. Some common motifs in their art are the falcon dancer, where you would have a dancing warrior athlete with a falcon mask or falcon decorations. There are these two male twin brothers that were heroes that were often depicted. And you also had one by the name of Redhorn, who is often seen as maybe one of the greatest chiefs in their history, whether it was based on a real person or purely mythology, who's to say? But the guy definitely seems like the archetype for what a chief is supposed to be and how he's supposed to act. One of the coolest features, I think, is he's typically depicted as having earrings of actually alive human heads. So his earrings would talk a lot of the times in the stories. And you actually do see lots of masks with guys with little faces in their earrings. And that comes up as a motif in a lot of their art. Now, Mississippian religion is incredibly fascinating. I'm not sure whether one could properly classify it as monotheistic or not, but it was clear that the chief, most important god was the sky god, the all-father in the sky, who reigned over the heavenly domain above. The Mississippian people believe that there were three general domains. The domain of heaven, where the birds and the winged angel people lived, as well as the sky father, the grand god himself. There was the middle plane, where people lived. That was the normal day-to-day world that existed. And then there was the underworld, which was not seen as this hellfire and brimstone place, but was accessed through caves and was seen as very dark, wet cavern kind of environment. And you actually had all manner of demons and monsters that existed down there, including this kind of aquatic jaguar horned monster that is pretty cool. And the parallels between the sort of Judeo-Christian conception, or I guess just the Christian conception of heaven and hell, of God and angels and demons and the horned Satan. I mean, it's all very, very interesting. So on top of building massive earthwork pyramids and being expert master coppersmiths, the favorite pastime by far of the Mississippian people was the biggest sport in America at that time. So currently, one might say that football has captured the imaginations of America. Maybe previously it was baseball. Well, in this period, the sport that Americans were playing was known as chunky. And chunky is really fascinating. I wish I could see it played today or could play it myself. So how it's played is that there's a rolling stone where one person would roll it in a big field. I mean, these are like big stadium environments where lots of people are watching, and the bets are very intense. So one person would roll a stone, and then the competitors would take a wooden spear called a chunky stick, and they would throw it. And the rule is that you have to throw your spear before the stone stops. But once the stone stops rolling and settles in a location, whoever spear gets the closest wins a point. And these people were serious about this game. They played it all the time, anytime there was a spare moment, and there were big competitions with, spectators of thousands of people getting into this gambling on this, betting big. There are, stories of people betting their lives on games of Chunky and committing suicide after losing. It was a big deal. But eventually, just like the ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon, the Mississippian culture would also collapse and come to an end. While we may not know the exact chronology and sequence of events that led to the collapse of civilizations like at Chaco Canyon or the Mississippians at Cahokia, we do know that climate played a significant role. Not just in these two regions, but all across America at the time, the climate was shifting, creating decades of droughts. Terrible for agriculture, terrible for maintaining a civilization. Literally, tribes and civilizations all across America would all collapse or face significant hardships all around the same time, about 1300 AD. The third and final civilization that we're going to be looking at today is a little bit of a cheeky inclusion on my part, I will admit. Most dating would put this civilization as being far later than this period. However, many of the oral traditions do tell of a solar eclipse which marked the beginning of the Iroquois Confederacy in the year 1140. So it just, by a technicality, could be included in this discussion of 12th century civilizations, but mostly it's just because I wanted to talk about them because they're so cool. So I should clarify that they're called the Iroquois, but they would call themselves the Haudenosaunee. Now, the story of the rise of the Iroquois is fascinating. Out of a period of chaos, which may very well have been coinciding with those very difficult climactic shifts that we were talking about and the resource scarcity that resulted, we know that there was a period that was known to these people as having widespread warfare, a very unstable area, a region where all kinds of tribes were warring with each other for resources, and it was total chaos. Out of this, the great peacemaker and the great mother brought together a confederation of tribes based on political principles that we recognize today, such as the idea of federalism, the idea of individual sovereignty, individual rights, democracy, representation, all of these concepts, which are seen as the bedrock of Western democracies and are viewed as Western European Enlightenment principles, can be traced back to the Iroquoian Confederacy and the rise that the people that are known to history as the Great Peacemaker and the Great Mother, and the people that were able to bring together all these warring tribes into one cohesive unit and brought peace to these tribes. And that is not to say that they were all lovey-dovey, peace-loving. No, it's just they formed a grand alliance against all those that were not in the alliance. But within the alliance, there were systems to deal with any disputes that would come up. There were very advanced and sophisticated political and legislative and judicial. They came up with the balance of power. It's really like the checks and balances in the American system. And the parallels between the American government system and the Iroquois Confederacy are not simple coincidence. In fact, I think in the 80s, the U.S. government admitted and said, it is a matter of fact that the founding fathers borrowed a lot of the political ideology that they founded America upon from the Iroquois Confederacy, and the checks and balances principle, representative democracy, personal sovereignty and rights, all of these things were worked out in the Iroquois Confederacy, whether or not it was in the 15 or 1600s or back in 1140. Sometime during this pre-Columbian period, these people came together and formed quite an advanced civilization. And it is no coincidence, even influencing the European Enlightenment, which blows a lot of people's minds. But if you look at the actual lineages and the history involved, an Iroquoian chief by the name of Kondiaronk actually traveled to Europe and mingled with the upper classes of Europe and the very people responsible for ushering in the European Age of Enlightenment. I mean, Rousseau met this guy and was very fascinated by his ideas. And it is not unrealistic to say that the Iroquois Confederacy and the principles of democracy, freedom, and things that we normally associate with the European Enlightenment and the founding fathers of America actually have an intellectual root back to the great peacemaker and the great mother of the Iroquois Confederacy. So there it is. There's our tour of 3 of the great civilizations of medieval America. Now, if I missed your favorite Native American tribe or an episode in this period of history in America that you think is just a tragedy that I wouldn't have talked about, please do talk about it in the comments, because like I said, I do love this period of history. It's just for time constraints, I decided to limit it only to the 3 we talked about today. So let me know your thoughts. I'm very interested to hear about if you knew anything about these subjects, because I certainly did not learn this growing up in America attending public schools. So I definitely think that we should be talking about these subjects a lot more, because like I said, it's fascinating history, and we owe a lot of what we are now today to some of these people like the Iroquois. So that's all for me today, guys. Like, comment, and please, I appreciate all of you that leave comments and that those of you that subscribe. It means a lot to me. I really do read all of your comments. So let me know what you think about this video, and if there's a subject that you really would love for me to talk about in science or history, please do suggest it for me below. And if you want to email me or set up a debate or suggest an idea, my email is criticalbasedinquiries@gmail.com. Thanks, guys.